Welcome to this online lesson on children in Nazi Germany. The aims of this lesson are to describe the activities of children in Nazi Germany, to explain how the Nazis controlled children, and to evaluate the extent to which children fought back against the Nazis. If you're a GCSE student, you'll need to look at things in more detail than this lesson will provide. Nevertheless, this should still be some useful revision for you. If you're a Key Stage 3 student, then this will give you a good understanding of the basics of how the children were treated in Nazi Germany. So without further ado, we'll have a look at a couple of key words. In Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today are propaganda, a way of spreading a point of view and changing other people's opinions. You can look at this as being a little bit like an advert, but rather than trying to sell a product, you're trying to sell an idea. Indoctrination, the process of making somebody think and behave in a certain way. This is sometimes called brainwashing. Your tasks then: record the key words and definitions. Do so in your own words if possible. As an extension, if you want to think a little bit further, are there any examples of propaganda and brainwashing in the modern world? Pause the video here while you complete those tasks. Okay, hopefully we've got those definitions down because we will need them later on. What about propaganda and brainwashing in the modern world? Well, the truth is, it is certainly around. In some countries, which are less free than Western democracies like the United Kingdom, propaganda is very obvious. Look, for example, at North Korea, where propaganda supporting the party and the leader Kim Jong-un is incredibly pervasive throughout the entire society. It's just everywhere. However, propaganda can be far more subtle than that. Things like fake news being spread on social media would be an example of modern-day propaganda that we would even get in this country. Youth activities in Nazi Germany. What did the Nazis want to do with children? How did they want to make them useful both to the Nazis at the time and what they hoped would be a Nazi future that thankfully never came to pass? Well, there were ranges of activities that were tried out. Games, sports, physical education, parading and camping, all of them appealed to young people at the time. Children were brainwashed into loyalty with the Führer, Adolf Hitler, and they were fed anti-communist and anti-Semitic hatred. So this means that the children would grow up to hate the biggest enemies of the Nazis, the communists, and of course anti-Semitic means anti-Jewish, and we should by now be familiar with the fact that the Nazis were horrible to Jewish people and really hated them. Later on, children also believed that they were helping in the war effort. Some, right at the end of the war, even took part in the fighting. This photograph is one of the last photographs ever taken of Adolf Hitler. Look how young some of those soldiers are. They are in fact wearing the uniforms of Hitler Youth organisations, and yet they were still being issued with anti-tank rockets in the end of 1945. So brainwashed were these children into believing that they were fighting for a good cause. Sadly they were not, and sadly many of them would have been killed. Imagine being given this timetable. In a previous time, I used to trick a class by giving them this timetable and claiming that that was how the school day was changing. Don't worry, I soon revealed to them that this was a bit of a practical joke on them, but it was interesting to see their reactions to this. So imagine being given a timetable where between 8 and 8:45, yes, you read those times correctly, you would do English. Then you'd do a mixture of geography, history, singing, and geography and history again throughout the rest of the week, including Saturday. Then there was something called race study and political party beliefs. You'd eventually get a break with sports and special announcements. I wonder what those would be. Domestic science with mathematics, domestic science being basically housekeeping, and the science of breeding and choosing a partner, something called eugenics or health biology. And then between 2 and 6 every day, there would be sport. Right, surely you've noticed so far that this is a very long day. Also, what are some of these weird lessons that are creeping in here? Well, first of all, I'm going to point out pretty obviously that this is based upon a Nazi timetable, and we're going to be looking at this in more detail in a moment. But I just want you to go with your gut beliefs to begin with, because children's lives were changed by the Nazis as well. So I want you to put yourself in their shoes. Imagine being given this timetable. What is similar to your existing school experience? What difference most surprises you? What difference would you actually quite like? If there are none that you'd quite like, then explain why. What difference would you be most against or most worried by? And as an extension, overall, would you like or dislike this timetable? Now be careful here. Read between the lines. There are some pretty racist things creeping in here. Race study, for example, is nothing to do with science. It's all about judging people based upon their background, which I hope you'll agree with me is not something that you really want to be doing. Anyway, pause the video now and go with your gut instincts and answer those questions in the blue box. Pause now. Okay, how did you get on? Well, based upon my experience of introducing this to real-life classes and getting their immediate feedback, some of the most common objections are these. Firstly, they don't like the idea of having to get up earlier in the morning, and they definitely don't like the idea of coming into school on a Saturday. There was a mixed reception, though, for having sport in the afternoons. Some people really liked the idea of doing sport every day until later in the evening, whereas others were really worried about this and didn't want to do it. Virtually always, people were at the very least concerned or confused by the idea of doing political party beliefs and race study as part of the school day every single day, and they're beginning to realise that this might be a form of indoctrination or brainwashing. So let's have a look at what I've based this timetable on. It is, of course, really based upon a timetable from a Nazi school, specifically a 1935 timetable from a girls' school in Nazi Germany. Boys' curriculum would be similar to this, but with some differences as well. Your tasks then. Firstly, list all the lessons that are blatantly brainwashing or indoctrinating pupils to accept Nazi beliefs. Secondly, consider your lesson on Nazi women, if you did that lesson. How was this timetable designed to encourage girls to become focused on children and family as the Nazis wanted? Finally, as an extension, what, if anything, could children do to oppose or go against this type of education? Pause the video while you complete those tasks. So what were our thoughts? Hopefully we've noticed that race study and Nazi party beliefs are the most blatant examples of brainwashing. However, don't forget the science of breeding, so-called. That fits in with the Nazi belief about people choosing partners based upon their racial background. A very worrying idea indeed, but one that is part of the brainwashing. But there are some less obvious examples too. Studying German, of course, is the equivalent of studying English to us. But the sort of literature that they would study would be focused towards propaganda helping sell Nazi ideas. Also, history would focus on things about Germany that made Germany look very powerful or great, or made Germany look badly treated by their enemies. Also, geography would show how small Germany was compared to some other countries and how they might want to grow their empire. And singing? Well, they would be singing traditional German songs, but also songs that supported the Nazi party. So virtually all of the school day was about brainwashing you. Even the sports, to a certain extent, was about that too. What about the idea of girls being brainwashed into becoming mothers and simply focusing on that? Well, an awful lot of this would be based towards that, but the most obvious example would be the domestic science with mathematics, basically teaching girls how to make beds, repair clothes, cook meals, and run the family economy. In other words, knowing how much you spend on your groceries every week. This is a very sexist curriculum. And in fact, there was an equally sexist curriculum for the boys too. Boys and girls were taught in rather different ways in German schools, as we will see. This is an example of a race study lesson, just in case you didn't understand really what we were going on about with that. This is an illustration taken from a German children's book called Der Giftpilz, which means the toadstool. It's a very anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish book, horrifying by today's standards and actually very worrying even by the standards of many Germans at the time. A really blatant example of propaganda against Jewish people. The caption reads, "How to tell a Jew. The Jewish nose is bent. It looks like a number 6. All racist nonsense, obviously, but this is what German children were being taught. So take some moments to think about that and complete this task. What does this source tell us about how the Nazis changed schools and education? Pause the video while you give that some thought and answer the question. Clearly, the Nazis are changing schooling to make it more racist and to make it fit in with their twisted worldview. In this way, the young people would be brainwashed to accept Nazi beliefs without question. But to what end? Well, it wasn't just to spread the Nazis' evil, it was about securing it for the future too. Here's how. We're going to watch a video now called Education for Death. This is a very famous video. Have a look at the 2 screenshots I've got from YouTube. Do you recognise the animation style? It is in fact produced by the Walt Disney Company. Yes, this is a Disney film all about the Nazis. Well, that might be surprising until you realise when this was made. Your task will be, what impression of German education does this film give? I provided a link to both the film and a review of this film by someone who takes it apart and discusses it in quite some detail. And you can watch both. It'll take you about 25 minutes if you want to watch both, or just 10 minutes if you want to just watch the propaganda film Education for Death. Like I say, links are provided in the description for you to follow. Secondly, how reliable is this film as a historical source? Now, I should point out that this was made as propaganda by the Americans in World War II. It was produced variously in 1942 and 1943. So, at this time, America was at war with Germany. Of course they wanting to give a negative view of the Germans. And so some of these films might be exaggerated to help highlight that. But other parts of it are actually quite truthful about the Nazi ideas as to how they wanted children to kind of behave and what effect education should have on them. And in this way, it's quite useful for understanding how the Nazis treated children and to what end. Pause the video while you complete those tasks and watch those videos. Then, when you're ready to continue, press play and we'll discuss it further. It's an interesting film. Some of the bits are actually quite funny and entertaining, and it's designed to be. This is, after all, the sort of thing that will be shown in the cinema before the main feature, just to make you laugh, but also to have a few hidden messages in it. The thing is, much of what is shown there in terms of the ideas is absolutely true. Young boys like little Hans in the film were being brainwashed to become unquestioning soldiers for the Nazis. And although some of the methods used are rather exaggerated, actually the means by which this was done was pretty much true. Let's look at that in more detail. Basically, the focus for the 2 types of schools were for boys, physical education, and for girls, home economics or housekeeping, and some PE as well. So why did the Nazis give boys and girls rather different lessons? Well, firstly, have a look at this source here. This is German boys at a sports festival having a grenade throwing contest. You can see the boy on the right there is holding a long stick grenade, sometimes referred to as the potato masher because that's what it looks like. Here we can see German girls outside their schools wearing traditional German clothing associated with unmarried girls. Notice the flowers in their hair. What do the sources suggest the Nazis wanted boys and girls to be when they grew up? Secondly, both boys and girls had to do more PE. Why was this important to the Nazis? Thirdly, do these sources suggest that Nazi schooling was sexist? And as an extension, how would Nazi sexism be harmful to both the boys and the girls? Pause the video and complete those tasks now. It'll probably take you about 10 to 15 minutes. So let's consider first of all the source with the boys. Having a grenade throwing competition, both in terms of the distance you can throw it and the accuracy with which you can throw it, is a basic and pretty blatant military skill. This is teaching boys how to be soldiers. The girls are rather less obvious, but really what these girls are being taught to do is to make themselves nice and pretty so that they can go out and find a husband. That's what it's all about, and that's why I included in the caption the point that this was unmarried girls. Secondly, both boys and girls had to do more PE. For the boys, this was pretty obvious again. Fit and healthy soldiers tend to be better soldiers. But for the girls, well, the Nazis believed that being fit and healthy was a virtue. And in that respect, perhaps we can for once agree with them. But this was done in a more twisted way. It was about showing that the Germans were somehow racially better than other countries. Complete nonsense. Also, it was believed that fit and healthy mothers would have fit and healthy children. Thirdly, do these sources suggest that Nazi schooling was sexist? Well, absolutely it does. Hopefully you've been able to identify why. But how would this be harmful to both the boys and the girls? Well, remember that this sexism is about restricting their opportunities. It harms the boys because it makes them think that there's nothing in the world that they can be other than violent and soldierly. Similarly, it convinces the girls that there's nothing in the world that they can be other than housekeepers and mothers. Whereas, of course, we would understand today, I would hope, that opportunities to both boys and girls should be equal. Ultimately then, this is all about turning the boys into soldiers. And the fact of the matter is, the boys in that photograph from the 1930s would have been the adults and young soldiers of the Second World War, like the young man who's clearly traumatized in the photograph there, taken on the Eastern Front of World War II in 1943. And for the girls, they were expected to become mothers and to look after children, have as many children as possible, and to keep an organised home. So in summary then, what was the purpose of Nazi schooling? In a paragraph, use real examples of both boys and girls in your answer to explain what the purpose of Nazi schooling was. Spend about 5 to 10 minutes on that, but you probably only spend about 5 minutes on it, truthfully, and pause the video while you're doing that. Pause now. Hopefully we've identified that Nazi schooling was all about brainwashing boys into becoming the future soldiers and all about brainwashing girls to be the good Nazi mothers that Hitler wanted. Very sexist, very restricted, and very worrying. But what about outside school? Surely it was easy enough to control the curriculum and what children learnt within schools. In fact, even the teachers had to join the Nazi party just to keep their jobs. But outside school it was more difficult. Lots of children came from families that weren't in fact Nazi, even if they'd ended up voting Nazi in some of the last elections that Germany held before World War II. Hitler recognised that the children would be the future of the Nazi party. He also recognised that their minds were more mouldable than adults who had had lots more experience than them. So he was really keen on the idea of brainwashing children even outside of school hours as well as while they were at school. The most famous example of this was the so-called Hitler Youth. We can see a poster here showing a typical Hitler Youth boy in his brown shirts with tie, with Hitler in the background. The text reads, Jugend dient dem Führer, alle 10 Jahren in die HJ. And my German's pretty terrible, as you can tell, but it basically means young people serve the leader. All 10-year-olds in the Hitler Youth. So the Nazis banned the scout organisations in 1935 and replaced them with the Deutsches Jungvolk for boys aged 10 to 14, so this basically means the German young people, and the Hitlerjugend or Hitler Youth for boys aged 14 to 18. And as I say, both of these groups were for boys. We'll have a look at the girls' groups in a moment. They took part in the following main activities: camping, survival skills, map reading skills, learning and singing Nazi songs to teach them racist Nazi ideas, shooting competitions, fitness and sports, and lessons on Hitler and Nazi ideas. If anyone's ever shown an interest in the scouting movement, or if you ever have been a scout, you will recognise that some of those activities are in the modern scout movement, the idea particularly of camping and surviving skills being really obvious ones. And these were popular activities among young people. Here Hitler is turning these activities into something more though. It's again about military training. Not only that, it's about controlling them and taking them away from their homes so they can be better brainwashed by the Hitler Youth leaders. Further to that, let's have a look at this source. Source B is a series of tests of what a Hitler Youth boy aged 10 to 14 would have been expected to do to get an achievement award or badge. Girls would do a similar series of tests but would be taught extra duties like learning to make a bed. To gain your Hitler Youth Achievement Award, complete the following lessons: The Life of Hitler, Germans Abroad, Germany's Rightful Place in the World, National Holidays of the German People, 5 Flag Oaths, and 6 Hitler Youth songs. Secondly, complete the following athletic tests: Run 60 metres in 10 seconds. Long jump 3.25 metres. Throw a small leather ball 35 metres. The small leather ball, of course, would be quite a lot like a grenade. Pull up on a bar twice. Somersault backwards twice. And swim 100 metres. Thirdly, hiking and camping tests. A day's hike of 15 kilometres. Camp in a tent for 3 days. Put up a 2-man tent and take part in putting up a 12-man tent. Make a cooking pit and find water for cooking. Know the names of the most important trees. Use the stars to find your place on a map. And target practice. Hit a bullseye on a target at a distance of 8 metres with an air gun. It's pretty clear what the Nazis are getting at here, but you're now going to do some tasks to show that you know that. Firstly, sort the activities, those are the bullet points down to the left, under 2 headings: military skills and brainwashing. Some might indeed go under both. Secondly, using point, example, explain how the Hitler Youth trained boys to be soldiers. I've provided a basic writing frame to use if you need it. And as an extension, in what ways did the Hitler Youth take ideas from the Scout movement? How was it different? It'll take you maybe 15 minutes to write down all those things, so pause the video now while you complete those tasks. Okay, hopefully we've noticed that camping, survival skills, map reading skills, shooting competitions and fitness and sports can all count as military skills. Learning and singing Nazi songs and lessons on Hitler and Nazi ideas are very much more in the brainwashing camp. But it is true to say that these military skills themselves were in a sense brainwashing. In terms of the extension then, how are these things similar to the Scout movement? Well, the modern Scout movement, as I've already mentioned, does lots of camping, survival skills, map reading and so forth, and it's all very useful and enjoyed by millions of people. The difference is the Scout movement is not about learning to be subservient to someone like Adolf Hitler. It is not about learning racist ideas. Far from it, the Scout movement is international and is very proud of the fact that people from all over the world take part in it. Of course, the Nazis didn't want that. They felt that the Scout movement was too international even back in the 1930s, and they wanted to restrict people to be thinking just about Germany. But what about the girls? The girls' organisation was known as the League of German Girls. So these organisations for girls followed similar lines to the boys. The Jungmädelbund for girls aged 10 to 14, so this is the League of Young Girls, and the Bund Deutsches Mädel for girls aged 14 to 18, which means the League of German Girls, sometimes shortened to BDM. They took part in the following main activities: camping and outdoor activities, although it should be said that there was less of this than the boys enjoyed. Learning and singing Nazi songs to teach them racist ideas, same as the boys did. Learning how to make and repair clothes. Learning how to cook. Fitness and sports as well. Lessons on Hitler and Nazi ideas, and being encouraged to rebel against their parents if they weren't Nazi enough. Also, learning how to work on a farm. Later on, older girls in the League of German Girls would do something called land service, where they would learn how to operate farm machinery and operate as basically farmers. Your task then. Sort the activities under two headings: housework skills and brainwashing. Some might go under both, but equally, are there any that don't fit? Perhaps come up with your own heading for those. Secondly, using point, example, explain again, and again I've included a writing frame for you. How did the BDM, or Bund Deutsches Mädel, the League of German Girls, train girls to be Nazi mothers? And thirdly, why might girls being skilled farmers be useful to the Nazis if war broke out? Again, about 10 minutes should be enough on that, so pause the video while you complete those tasks. Let's see. So housework skills. Learning how to make and repair clothes, learning how to cook. Those would both come under the heading of housework skills. Arguably, camping and outdoor activities could do as well, because many of the skills were transferable. In terms of brainwashing, the learning of the songs again is a really obvious one. Fitness and sports could come into that, and lessons on Hitler and Nazi ideas would be as well. But perhaps most of all for the girls, being encouraged to rebel against their parents. So if their parents were trying to teach them not to be so like little Nazis, they were encouraged to go against them. Not only that, learning to work on a farm is maybe something of an odd one out. It would include some survival skills, it would certainly include some fitness from all the heavy work, but really this was about preparing girls for a possible future role, and that's where the extension comes in. It was expected that in a large-scale war, lots of men would have to go off and join the army, so there would be no one to work on the farms and supply food for the German people. It was here that the Nazis recognised that the girls might have a role in becoming farm labourers while the boys were away at war. Again, this shows the typical sexism of the time, but it also shows how the Nazis further twisted that to their own ends. Let's have a look at these people then. They don't look like the typical Hitler Youth, and in fact they're not. These young people are in a swing group, named after the swing or jazz music from America that they enjoyed. But look in detail at the photograph. Why would they attract negative attention from the Nazi authorities? Why would the Nazis be so unhappy with them? Study the photograph closely and pause the video while you note down some ideas. Pause the video now. What sort of things did you notice? Hopefully we can recognise some of the differences from the Hitler Youth children that we've looked at before. Firstly, you may have noticed their clothing. It's American-style clothing, not traditionally German, and certainly not the Hitler Youth uniforms that we've seen before. The music they're playing, things like the guitars with jazz and swing. Jazz and swing music in America originated with African-American communities, and the racism of the Nazis really hated that. Also, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls were separate. They didn't like boys and girls mixing and flirting when they were too young. Well, here they're doing very much as teenagers do today and mixing all together and having a very good time. Lastly, who noticed this? Smoking. Actually, Hitler was very anti-smoking. He recognised the bad health effects that it had, and he wanted these people to grow up to be fit and healthy soldiers. Today, we recognise the dangers of smoking much more widely, and smoking is nothing like as widespread as it would have been in the 1930s and 1940s when the health effects were less well understood. Nevertheless, actually smoking as teenagers at that time was a further rebellion, not just because it was bad for their health, but because it went against the ideas that people were being taught in the Hitler Youth. So, while I can't support people smoking, it is an example of opposition to the Nazis, and that is something I can support. Most of all, though, these people are very clearly not in the Hitler Youth. That was a particular problem for the Nazis, because from 1936 onwards, membership of the Hitler Youth for those aged 10 to 18 was compulsory. You didn't have a choice. You had to be in one of the Hitler Youth organisations. By refusing to go, these people were breaking the law, and by breaking the law, they could face harsh punishments, as we will see. Here's another example of youth opposition, though. Not all young people supported the regime. These two people are Sophie Scholl, on the right, and her brother Hans Scholl. They were members of an organisation called the White Rose. This was a group of university students who, in secret, printed propaganda materials that were against the Nazis. They would leave these in subtle but public places, like on the tops of public toilets, for example. That way, their message could get out there and people could start beginning to question the Nazis. However, the White Rose group did get the attention of the Gestapo, or the secret state police. Sadly, the White Rose group was captured, and both Sophie and Hans Scholl were brutally executed. But what were their activities? They published anti-Nazi propaganda. They distributed leaflets around Munich University, where they went. And they were prompting other Germans to question the Nazi regime and to think for themselves. So, what did the Nazis recommend was the action against them? That the group should be immediately suppressed or put down. The group members were to be sent to Dachau concentration camp, where they might be worked to death. And there was the brutal execution of both Sophie and Hans Scholl, who were executed by guillotine. That's right, they were actually beheaded. So your question then, write down an answer for this. Why might the university education of the White Rose group make them more of a threat to the Nazis? Give that some careful thought. If you're stuck, maybe note down some of the activities of the White Rose group and what happened to them in the end. But whichever you choose, pause the video now while you complete that task. The fact was that the Nazis were threatened by people who were educated. They relied on people remaining ignorant to a certain extent. Ignorance tended to make it easier to mould their ideas to fit in with what the Nazis wanted. University-educated people tended to be able to read lots of books and to get a wider view on the world and therefore question what the Nazis were doing, and this made them a particular threat to the Nazis. Not only that, but they wrote very persuasively and very eloquently, which meant that they could be more persuasive for those people reading the propaganda. Here's another example of opposition against the Nazis, the Edelweiss Pirates. An Edelweiss is a small white flower that has become a traditional symbol in southern Germany. They are named after the traditional German flower I mentioned, and these groups refused to join the Hitler Youth. Instead, they actually attacked them. So these people would go out into the streets and if they saw other Hitler Youth members in their uniform, they'd go and beat them up. Okay, we don't condone people beating each other up, but this is an example of youth opposition to the Nazi Party. They also vandalised places. Again, we can't condone that, but if it's against the Nazis, then maybe we can understand it. They vandalised places and put up anti-Nazi graffiti, things like posters and slogans. They also assisted deserting German soldiers and shot down Allied airmen. They actually wanted Germany to lose the war. So, are the Edelweiss Pirates a greater threat than the swing groups? Explain your point of view. Remember the swing groups from the photograph earlier, and it's more about the lifestyle that they led. Are the Edelweiss Pirates more direct in their action against the Nazis? Check out, for example, the Edelweiss Pirates song at the top, a far cry from the Nazi songs that the Hitler Youth learned. Hitler's dictates make us small, we're yet bound in chains, but one day we'll again walk tall, no chain can us restrain. For hard are our fists, yes, and knives at our wrists, for youth to be free, Navajos lay siege. The reference to the Navajos here is because cowboy and Indian stories were very popular with children at this time, even in Germany. So are the Edelweiss Pirates a greater threat than the swing groups? Explain your point of view and explain it with some examples from what we've seen here. Pause the video while you complete that. So what was the Nazi reaction to these groups? The Nazis hated anybody who stood against them, and they could be brutal towards them. And just because these people were children, it doesn't mean that they got any softer treatment from the Nazis themselves. So Nazi reactions to youth opposition. Himmler's terror organizations came down hard on these children who rebelled. Heinrich Himmler was the leader of Hitler's terror squads. Propaganda was used against them and their musical tastes. Take, for example, this very racist caricature. Notice that the black man has got some very exaggerated facial features, which is typical of racist cartoons at the time. He's playing a jazz saxophone, and he even has a Jewish Star of David on him. This is all about discrediting the sort of music that German children were enjoying at this time if they weren't in the Hitler Youth. Edelweiss Pirates and swing groups were publicly humiliated and could even be sent to concentration camps. Sophie and Hans Scholl were guillotined. Some members of the Edelweiss Pirates were publicly hanged, especially towards the end of World War II. Here is a picture of them being prepared to be hung in the town of Cologne in Germany. These Edelweiss Pirates in particular had put up anti-Nazi propaganda towards the end of the war. As Allied armies were approaching, they were judged to be traitors, and they were publicly hanged all at the same time. None of them was older than 14. Why do you think the Nazis came down so hard on these groups of children? After all, they were just being children, but they were rebelling against the Nazis as well. So give that some thought, write down your answer, and pause the video while you do so. To finish up then, let's consider an opinion or statement. The Nazis had complete control of young people in Germany. Give at least one example that backs up the above statement. Give at least one example that opposes or goes against the above statement. And lastly, overall, how far do you agree with that statement? And you must explain why too. Remember, when you are asked how far, you've got to give an idea of the extent. So do you entirely agree? Do you not agree at all? Do you agree to a very large extent? Or do you agree only a little bit or to a small extent? Whatever you choose, explain your answer with examples that we've looked at in the lesson. Pause the video while you do that. Certainly the Nazis wanted to have complete control over the young people in Germany because they felt that this was a way of securing the future. However, there were some brave rebels against this. And while in modern times we wouldn't condone their tactics, we must remember one thing. They had no other option. Unlike today, where in a democracy you can vote out your opponents, or you can learn to become more politically active so that when you're old enough to vote you can take part in an informed way in elections, Nazi Germany did not have that sort of freedom. And so these children, some of them, decided to take more extreme actions. And for that, they were very harshly punished. And for those that were brainwashed, well, many of them would end up dead in World War II. Those that weren't dead had to learn to become more democratic and more fair after the war. Really, children lost out in Nazi Germany terribly. On that note, the lesson is over. I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful and interesting, and if it has, give the video a like if that option is available, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much.